folks, welcome to News 1 Now. Democracy Awakening culminated their protest here in D.C. over the weekend. Democracy Awakening, of course, was a gathering of nearly 200 organizations that came to the nation's capital to focus on 3 days of action. It really began on Friday and it concludes today. Their focus deals with voting rights, money in politics, and the vacancy on the Supreme Court, of course. And so you see the video there that took place over the weekend. And as I said, things would happen today as well, a day of action, day of protest. Actress and activist Rosario Dawson was among the 900 people arrested throughout the weekend of protest. Most were charged with a misdemeanor, processed and released on the scene. Joining us to discuss Democracy Awakening is the pastor of the First Trinity Missionary Baptist Church in Flint, Michigan, Reverend Ezra Tillman. Also joining me on the panel, Mark Thompson, of course, the host of Make It Plain on Sirius XM Radio. He also was out there over the weekend. Sure, Michael Singleton, a Republican political consultant, George Jefferson Nuri, CEO of In the Public Eye Communications, and Quentin James, COO and founding partner of Vested Strategies. So, folks, first and foremost, this wasn't just a series of protests on Sunday. You really had training sessions taking place as well, other sort of activities, a lot of different things taking place beginning on Friday and then going until today. And so let's start with today, though. What is going to happen today with Democracy Awakening? Mark?
Well, there's going to be a march this morning. Thank you for having me, by the way, Roland. Good morning. There's going to be a march this morning from Columbus Circle to the Capitol, and then there'll be a rally and more than likely more civil disobedience. People will be standing up for the issues that you mentioned, voting rights, getting big money out of politics, and also doing something about those two big words Dr. King used at the March on Washington, interposition and nullification. We've seen that throughout the Obama administration, and it's never been more glaring than it is now with the interposition and nullification of holding hearings on behalf of his Supreme Court nominee.
Ezra?
Yes, sir. Well, I'm not as familiar with that part. I wanted to make sure I was here for the initial rally to play our part to bring more light as possible to the Flint water crisis.
And again, that's also one of the issues that folks are focused on because that also speaks to government failing its residents, as folks are also making that point on so many other issues as well, especially on voting rights, also in the Supreme Court.
Yes, sir. The truth of the matter is the reason why we're at this point in time is because us not getting to the polls and not voting, we did not put ourselves in position to even know that we was at the mercy of emergency managers be put in a position to make decisions that will bring fatality even to our city and lives. Even this point, even as of last year, last month, there's been more reported lives that have been lost due to Legionnaire's disease. And so we need to get to the polls. We need to make sure that we realize how our vote matters and how to look towards the verbiage that will put us in better positions in the future.
Mark, when we talk about these various issues, first to have 200 plus organizations, what does this also mean now for mobilizing in the future? I mean, obviously having a series of activities this weekend was one thing, but also mobilizing folks to vote in local elections, state elections, and of course the presidential is also important.
Well, I think that is very important, and I think the direction is going there. At least one of the organizations involved, of course, is the NAACP, and they have been in the forefront of encouraging people to get registered and to get out and vote. And also because this is dealing with voter suppression and voting rights, one of the specific demands is to see to it that the new Voting Rights Act is passed, and there's some of the aspects that were stripped away by the Supreme Court in Section 4 also restored. I think that the whole conversation around the Supreme Court itself is one other instrument, Roland, to encourage people to get out to vote. This is an election when, unlike any other, it's really going to boil down to people casting their vote, not just for the president, but for the future of the Supreme Court. We're probably talking about one and maybe two appointments in the very, very near future. So we're talking about turning over Citizens United. We're talking about restoring Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. All of this is very important. And if there was ever a time for people to be motivated to register to vote, the time is now.
I want to piggyback on what Mark is saying here. I think one of the things that's being lost in the news coverage of this election cycle as we get into day after day after day talking about who has enough votes to get the delegates to get the nomination is that we've turned money into have the equality of having the same equality as having a vote. That money is a very important piece of this, and so the 527s can come in and really outvote you by putting in more money. And also to have the Voting Rights Act watered down so much between the last election and this one. And it's so important. I think the most important thing that happened this weekend or over the past week with Democracy Spring is bringing to the attention of the voter that the biggest threat right now is the watering down to your right to vote and the power of money to influence your vote.
Hold tight 1 second. This is some video here. Shelley, go ahead and pull this up, please, on my iPad, and pull the audio up. This is, of course, Cornell Brooks, head of the NAACP, speaking this weekend.
Also saying to this Congress, wake up. It's time to wake up and get up. As a woke generation, are here lifting up 3 very simple civic demands. The first of which is that this Congress act on the President's nominee to the Supreme Court. We simply note that Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, of the United States Constitution speaks about the Senate providing advice and consent. It says nothing about a vacation. It says nothing.
Now, of course, that's one of the issues that folks have also been focused on. And what is still interesting to me, though, is how do you take this but also go to the states, because meeting in D.C. is one thing, but getting folks mobilized locally is another.
It's really important, Roland. You have to think that this Democracy Spring, Democracy Awakening actually started off on a march in Philadelphia, and so they marched over 140 miles to come to D.C. From the states. And so I think as we look at what's happening today on Capitol Hill, it's going to motivate people around the country to really start this process of Democracy Spring, Democracy Awakening in their cities and their states around the country.
Sure, Michael?
I think what you're beginning to see is that this isn't a problem that's just relegated to Democrats. This is also something that Republicans are also concerned about. And if you look at the delegate process with Trump or even with Sanders, what you're beginning to see is Sanders is beating Hillary Clinton in some states. You're seeing Trump is beating the other 2 candidates in many states, yet they're getting more delegates. And a lot of people are saying, well, do my votes actually count at all? And if they do, why isn't the person that I voted for, the person who won overwhelmingly, getting all of the delegates or a majority of the delegates? So I do think that there is some legitimacy to the protesting here. That there was a study done last year by a professor at Princeton University that concluded over 20 years worth of research that showed that typically lobbyists and special interests and wealthy individuals, when they feel a certain way about a policy position, typically Congress votes in a way that's beneficial to them versus beneficial to the people.
Shelley, let's go to this video here, please. This is Reverend William Barber, who was also speaking this weekend at Democracy Awakening.
Allowing the Attorney General of the 21st century to have less power than the Attorney General had in 1965. 1,000 days. Allowing a race-driven legislature and governors all through this country to engage in laws. 1,000 days of the worst attacks on voting since the 19th century. And not only just this Congress, but if we're going to be nonpartisan and tell the truth, we've had more than 16 presidential debates, Democrats and Republicans, and none of them have focused on fixing the Voting Rights Act. That is a travesty to the blood of the martyrs. But not only is it a desecration, Rebecca, it's an attack on our democracy. Without the unabridged right to vote, the heart of the democracy is under attack. I come from the South, from North Carolina, where we have seen since Shelby the worst coordinated attack in this country. At the very time that African Americans are voting at 70%, and we're building fusion with progressive whites and Latinos, we've seen an extremist governor and legislature vote to put in place apartheid voting districts. We've seen them shorten the early voting period by a full week, because 70% of those that use the first week are African American. We've seen them eliminate same-day registration, because 43% of those that use same-day registration are African American. And we've seen them pass a strict form of photo ID that negatively impacts 300,000 voters. This is a racial and class attack on our democracy. And let it be clear, the attack on voting rights is not just an attack on black people, it's an attack on labor, it's an attack on living wages, it's an attack on the peace effort, it's an attack on health care, it's an attack on women, it's an attack on LGBT community, it's an attack on climate change, it's an attack on justice and criminal justice reform, it's an attack on the common good and the general welfare of America. And let us understand why it is.
So when you hear Reverend Barber talk about all of these issues, he is framing this in a different way. And I think one of the things I want to talk about is this whole idea. He talks all the time about fusion politics, how even in North Carolina, they have been able to focus on the issues, and then that has brought together folks who are also conservative, realizing that if you don't expand, you don't have Medicaid expansion, that affects their hospitals. Ezra, what about that also dealing with Flint? People assume that this is a black thing, but you got white residents in Flint who are saying, look, our water is affected too. This is not just black water.
Yes, that's really what has given us the push we have so far, because you want to make it a matter of life, humanity, period, not just a Black Lives Matter concept, but everyone has been mistreated. For the most part, the Hispanic community has been neglected. Most of all, they were the last to know. Many of their lives were still at a risk at the time that things got out. So it's a lot of complicated layers to the story, and we are praying, hopefully, that as you mentioned earlier about how to encourage the people to get involved and to get to the polls, because there's so many other things pressing and discouraging to them to even think about getting to the poll. How am I going to make it next week?
Mark?
So,
No, I would agree with that. You know, it really speaks to Reverend Barber's leadership. Moral Monday is just what it is. It's a moral movement, and it's nonpartisan, and I think that's what has attracted a number of people from all sides, all aspects. I mean, when would we have expected, even Roland 10 years ago, for an African-American preacher to suggest or participate in civil disobedience, which he's going to do a week from today, on behalf of the hate bill in North Carolina for LGBT. At one time, there was a lot of effort to divide the black church from the LGBT movement. So we've come a long way. And I think that what he represents, and I think what we're all trying to represent, even being here this weekend, because there'll be a lot of diversity out in the streets today. This is where Dr. King left off in 1968, dealing with economic issues. And he was the moral leader of the time. People who were black and white, people of all classes, of all aspects. This is what made him a danger. He had become larger than what they considered to be a small movement in Montgomery, and had expanded to a movement that was inclusive of all people who stood up for justice.
Well, the political notion of breaking apart the fusion of poor white people and poor black people dates back 400 years. As indentured servants were told they were at least a step above than the slaves, and they made the indentured servants the slave masters. And breaking apart these fusions has been a very powerful tool, and it's really, really good to see that Latinos and gays and blacks are not falling for this anymore.
Kickstart your day at 7 and get the news you need from the perspective you want. News 1 Now with Roland Martin, every weekday morning at 7 on TV 1.